I'd like to try to bring some of this to life for you to talk about my first experience of portfolio management and how some of these rather abstract words actually have kind of some real meaning and some real relevance. So let's get rid of the stuff that's not related to portfolio definition at the moment and focus on these 5 areas: understand, categorize, prioritize, balance and plan, which are pretty abstract, aren't they, when you think about it? So what do we mean by understand? Well, firstly, what we really mean is what the hell's going on around here? So in my first, we called it a program at the time, and it was our first journey into program management, and we were using MSP, but it was an organization of around 10,000 people. And there was a huge amount of change. There was change coming from the corporate center about a major restructure. We were in a division of, like I say, 10,000 people, which was pretty substantial in its own right. The corporate leads in that area had their own ideas where we were going, and this part of the organization that I was in, which was about 2,000 or 3,000 people, they had a new management board as well, and they had their own thoughts on where we should be going. So, and was also the normal change and business as usual type of stuff going on. And one of the things that this organisation or the boards had put together was a vision, and they'd come together. There'd been a restructure about 9 months earlier. They'd come together, done their vision thing, all these things that the senior management team wanted to do. And 6 to 9 months in, they realised actually nothing was happening. And I had this wonderful opportunity to actually go and help them. It was a moment that changed my life, to be honest. Anyway, so the first thing I did was listen to what they had to say, and we realised we had no idea actually how much was going on. What was the scale of activity? So the first pass that we did was to do an audit of all the projects that the senior managers had. So we had directors of HR, we had directors of operations, we had directors of health and safety, and all sorts of other things. So I did an audit of all of them and went through all the projects that they had, or all the initiatives that they had, because some of these things weren't projects, they were just stuff that had to go on. And we identified over 100 things that they were trying to do as a management team. There was about 8 or 9 of them. And of course, all of this was trying to happen all at the same time. So having done the first pass and identified all these projects or initiatives, we then had to work out how to deal with them. So that's why we talked about categorize, which is some way of bringing some structure to the situation and organize these things in a way. Now, some of them were pretty straightforward. So stuff under the HR director was pretty straightforward. She had the people change things to do. We had the director of technology. He had all the IT stuff to do. And all the kind of operational technology to deal with. But then there were other ones like health and safety that cut across it. And then there were operational directors who had their things to do as well. So so some of these things fitted quite nicely into what you might call director buckets. And then there were these other more complex things that were cross-cutting, and they couldn't own the bits themselves. They had to find a way of dealing with it. So like if you were refurbishing a building, so the director of property was refurbishing a building, he was affecting all the people in that building. So it wasn't just his project. So he had to find a way of categorizing and grouping things. The starting point was by directorate, and then we looked across the cross-cutting categories. So we had efficiency initiatives and that kind of stuff. And we also had the stuff that was coming in from the corporate center, which didn't necessarily line up with what we wanted to do, but they had to do. So then we had to think about how do we prioritize this stuff, which goes first and which doesn't. So using the old Moscow technique of must have, could have, should have, and won't have, we were able to say, well, these are the things we must do for the corporate center. These are the things we must do for our section of the business, and these are the things we want to do because they're the priorities for the management team. So that's how we prioritize them. And after the first pass on these, we managed to reduce the list of projects from over 100, which were basically all shoulds and wants to do's, down to 40 that we must do. And that's how we called it. And then there was some really strong leadership kicked in at that point, because we had the director, or the kind of managing director, for want of a better term, actually was saying, now these initiatives here have no resources. There's nothing going to happen for the next 2 or 3 years. So actually, we're not even going to talk about those anymore. And what we were seeing then was the formation of the portfolio pipeline. There was year 1, year 2, year 3 starting to emerge. So what does balance mean? Now, balance for me in this was, how much can we cope with? Because when I first got involved in this, it was clear we couldn't cope with the things that were needed in the time scale. So everybody wanted everything done this week or this month or this year. So that strategic thinking about, well, what can we actually cope with? So there were lots of satellite buildings. Well, if you looked at the way the projects were structured, and they were all going to, I don't know, the building in Coventry to do stuff at the same time, well, there was only 1 or 2 engineers that could cope with the tech people turning up. So we then had to kind of look across all the projects and go, well, when will they be hitting each one of these areas? And do we have the resources to cope with that project when it arrives? And therefore, we were able to stand back and bring structure and organisation to when things were going to land in certain places. And there were some things that we just decided weren't part of the portfolio and should just happen as business as usual. Yeah, kind of routine changes and upgrades to things. Yeah, maybe redecoration, replacing some hardware, whatever it happened to be, would be dealt with by local management. But they would know what the portfolio was planning, so they would see where their gaps were. And of course, we had to find other resources and train people up so they were able to cope with the change. But that was more part of what we mean by planning, because that was in effect a sequence of events that were going to happen over the next 2 to 3 years. So we could say year 1, the plan looks like this, year 2, the plan looks like this, and year 3, the plan looks like this. And then we could start even looking into years 3 and 4 and 5, say, well, what other things do we think are coming down the track? And I remember as a kind of a great moment at the end of this process, which took a few months, when the managing director sat back and looked at his plan and went, that's brilliant. I bet nobody else in this business knows what's going to happen for the next 3 years. So that's what that process of definition is. Okay, in the definition steps, they are to some extent sequential. Whereas when we come on to the delivery steps, they tend to run in parallel. So there's quite a difference. The tricky thing for definition is the world doesn't stop while you're doing it. So delivery may already be running, and we'll be coming onto that in a video a little bit later.